I'm loving this opportunity we have to spend time in the Sermon on the Mount. What a powerful, powerful text. I don't know about you, but my toes are already a little bit bruised today, and I'm grateful for that because we're challenged to grow closer together in our relationship with our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and with each other as we're spending time together in the singing, which has been amazing, and the fellowshipping, and my favorite time of all, spending time together as Christian women and looking at the Sermon on the Mount through a woman's perspective and seeing what we can learn and how we can challenge each other there. Because we are in the Sermon on the Mount, some of the pictures that you'll be seeing on the screen in this session and the next session were taken around Israel. A lot of the ones today, because of our theme with knowing others by their fruits, knowing ourselves by our fruits, are from different fruit-bearing trees that were taken around Israel. So please enjoy that as we go through these studies together. Several years ago, Neil and I, my husband, we went to a marriage retreat, and they did this really special thing at the end of the retreat. They let everybody stand up together as couples and turn and face each other and renew our vows together. All the couples that were there that attended this retreat got to renew their vows, and it was meaningful and special, and we didn't know it was going to happen. We didn't know it was coming. And so as we're leaving, Neil and I are driving away. This is in Tennessee. We're driving to Knoxville to go back to the airport, and we passed an antique store, which I love, and we went in there, and they had a jewelry section, which I also love, and they had a ring, a Tanzanite ring, and I love Tanzania. We've been there several times, and it was really special, and it was a beautiful ring, and it was a really dark purple stone, not one of those little pale stones, you know. And I fell in love with this ring, but we left the antique shop. And several miles down the road, you know, I got a little quiet. And Neil, you know how it is. All right, this part does not make me look good. I understand that. But Neil said, "What's on your mind?" And I was like, "Well, you know, for a Tanzanite ring, that was a really good deal, and we did just renew our vows." And we must have been 20 miles down the road, but he kind of went and turned around and went back, and he bought me that ring. Yes. Normally when I tell that story, I say, "We renewed our vows, and he bought me this ring," and it sounds much better. So it was a little big, and I ended up wearing it on my index finger, which I wasn't very crazy about, and decided when we got back home to take it to a local jeweler and have it sized to fit the finger I wanted to wear it on, and that's when I discovered it was not Tanzanite. It was lab-created sapphire. So, bummer there. No special ties to any sapphire anything. And we overpaid for lab-created sapphire. And so, you know, that was disappointing. Sometimes things do not turn out the way we think they should, and things aren't what we were told they were supposed to be, and that's a bummer for us. And sometimes it carries more significant consequences. It's not really that big of a deal, my whole ring situation, but you may remember hearing about the time in 2013 when Nelson Mandela had passed away and they aired his memorial. It was this huge deal, and there were a whole row of speakers, including the President of the United States. And they had hired an interpreter because they wanted everybody to be able to hear this memorial and these speeches, and the signer that they hired got up to interpret the messages, and not long into that, social media was blowing up with all kinds of comments. Some of you are smiling because you remember this. And people were saying things like, one lady in South Africa said, "This is rubbish. This guy does not know how to sign. Get him off." And people were saying, he's waving his hands and he's moving his arms, but it does not match what's being said. A real sign language interpreter said he's making the rest of us, he's making a mockery of our profession. And the chief executive of a charity for the hearing impaired ended up saying the whole thing was shocking, and that millions of hearing impaired people around the world ended up missing out on one of the biggest events in recent history. And something like that has greater greater consequences. And one person summed it up this way, and he said, the gentleman was a fake. And when we think about the word fake, it has all kinds of negative connotations, and it's part of who we are in our lives today. We look out for fake news because it's out there. You may have heard of fake nice. That's when you're on the job and you meet a coworker and she seems really sweet and friendly, and it doesn't take long before you realize she's fake nice because she's got a mean streak in her, and she's very competitive, and she says mean things about her coworkers. She's fake nice. And it's disappointing. But nothing is more disappointing than a fake Christian. And that's what we're going to be spending time talking about today. And for this lesson, I want us to use as our text Matthew chapter 7, and we're going to look at verses 15 through 29. So we're going to go to the end of the Sermon on the Mount. If you want to go ahead and turn over to Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 through 29. And what you see on the screen are some sheep taken in Nazareth. So let's look at verses 15 through 29. Beware of the false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor figs from thistles are they. So every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So then you will know them by their fruits. And Jesus is saying, beware. This is a warning. He's saying, pay attention, watch out for. There are false prophets, fake prophets, if you will. They look like sheep. So how they look is not going to clue us into anything. It's not going to give us any kind of warning signs about their motives or agendas or who they are. They look like sheep. They look like members of the flock, but they're not sheep. What are they? Wolves. Ravenous wolves. Does a wolf have the sheep's best intentions at heart? No, he's a predator. He's dangerous, and he is after the flock. And Jesus says, beware. And how are we going to know if a sheep is a wolf? What does he say? 2 times a phrase that we see. You will know them by their fruits. This is not the first warning that they would have received against false prophets. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 20 through 22, he says, some people are going to speak to you presumptuously in my name. And he says, you may say in your heart, how will we know? And he said, well, listen to what they say. If they speak to you a word and they say it's in my name, but that thing does not come to pass, then they have spoken presumptuously in my name. He's saying, if what happens doesn't match up with their words, then you'll know. They're fake. They're false prophets. You will know them by their fruits. And Jesus says, grapes do not come from thorn bushes and figs do not come from thistles. And I can envision him just pointing at the ground or the roadside as he's saying this, because thorns and thistles grow all over the Palestine region. And in Matthew 5:20, Jesus says in our text, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. The picture that you see on the screen, you can see they're all decked out, and we'll talk about some of the things that they're wearing. And actually, I took this picture from Carla Moore. She took this picture while we were in Jerusalem, and she's there right now. In fact, they're back in Israel. Unless your righteousness surpasses that of these guys, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And who are these guys? Who were the scribes and Pharisees? The religious leaders. We just heard a great lesson about that. And can you imagine their response to that? The respect that they would have, the authority that these guys have. Look at the way they look. I imagine as a listener, for Jesus to say, you have to do better than that. Were they dismayed? There's no way. I mean, look at them. And they wore these phylacteries. If you can tell, I'm not sure you can tell on that picture, there's a little black box at the top of his head. strapped to his forehead, and there's one strapped around his wrist onto his hand. And these were little boxes that they tucked 4 different scriptures inside, and probably got that from Deuteronomy chapter 6. You shall wear them as frontlets between your eyes and bind them on your hands, and to remind them of God's word. And they had these tassels. You can see the tassels kind of hanging down off that shawl. These long tassels from Numbers 15, verses 38 and 39. God said, I want you to wear these tassels to remind you of my commands. And so the tassels, as they would flow and they would bump up against them, would remind them of the commands from the Lord. Well, Jesus said in Matthew 23, verse 5, they wore extra wide phylacteries. They broadened those scripture boxes on their heads and their hands, and they wore extra long tassels or fringes, your version might say. And do you remember why Jesus said they did this? They broadened their phylacteries, they lengthened their tassels. Why? To be seen of men, to be noticed by men. That's what they were doing. So they looked the part. They looked the part, but Jesus was not pleased with what they were doing. And here's what we need to understand as we read through this, is the mentality of a first century Jew. Honor was hugely important. They strive to gain honor from other people for themselves. They wanted to be shown honor. Some of the verses that we might think about, James chapter 2, verse 3. Do you remember the part about showing partiality? And he would say, some people would come in and we would say, you sit here in this good place. But if somebody else came in, you sit down over here by the footstool. There were these places of honor. And they wanted to be the ones to walk in and be told, you sit over here in this good place. Or do you remember the mother of the sons of Zebedee going up to Jesus? Do you remember what she had the audacity to ask Jesus? Will you command that in the kingdom, one of my sons sits on your right hand and one of my sons sits on your left hand? Can you make sure that happens? What did she want for her sons? The places of honor. Never mind all the other disciples. She wanted them to have a place of honor. It was so important that they had this. And so they would spend their lifetime trying to gain, what can I do to draw attention to myself so that I can have honor and people will honor me? And sometimes they would put other people down in order to make themselves look better. Do you remember reading through Jesus' interaction and teachings, how the text would say they would go up to him and they would think of these difficult questions to trap him? What would that do? It would make him look bad and themselves look better. The crowds were being drawn to Jesus. They were following him and no longer following the Pharisees, and they were not okay with that. So they wanted to put him down to make themselves look better. Perhaps they would put down a neighbor or a business partner in some way so that they themselves would look better and gain more honor. And so knowing that about that type of mindset and the steps that they would take to gain that honor for themselves, when Paul says something in Romans 12, verse 10, show preference to one another and showing honor, that means a little bit more. I love how the ESV words it, outdo one another and showing honor. They're one-upping each other. They're trying to outdo one another and gaining honor for themselves. Paul says, outdo one another and showing honor towards somebody else. And the word there means to be a leader in this, to you go before, you lead the way in giving other people honor. Well, the easiest way to gain honor is by our appearance. And certainly the scribes and Pharisees look the part, and you can almost imagine now that I'm thinking, what's going on in their head? Notice my oversized phylacteries. See these long trailing fringes on the hem of my garment. Mind you, don't trip over them now. So that when somebody sees me, somebody sees them, they're thinking, wow, look at them. There goes a person worthy of much honor. Because they looked a certain way. And Jesus said they have completely missed the point, and they were more interested in seeking the approval of men than one up each other, gaining honor for themselves than in pleasing God. Jesus would even say in Matthew 23, verses 6 and 7, you remember this, they love the place of honor at banquets and the chief seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces. They love being called rabbi by men. So I'm looking around this room. I'm not noticing any phylacteries. Maybe some tassels. What is our warning as we think about looking the part and missing the point? And maybe it's not trying to dress like some kind of religious leader so that people would say, oh, there goes a person to be honored. But what is our caution and our warning? I'd like to talk about a couple of things that I think maybe we need to do a little heart check. This picture is a date palm. They grow all around the Dead Sea area. So remember in Matthew 23, it's already been mentioned here this weekend. He says over and over again, Jesus says, woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, what? Hypocrites. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. And notice in your Bible in Matthew chapter 6, also in the Sermon on the Mount, look at verse 1. Matthew chapter 6. Beware, another warning, of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. Now, he's not mentioning hypocrisy in this verse. And maybe that seems a little harsh. It could be just a matter of poor motives. Maybe a little heart struggle with wanting some glory, some people to pay attention to me and pat me on the back. But is it really hypocrisy? Look at verse 2. So, when you give to the poor, do not sound a trumpet before you as the, who? Hypocrites. Jesus says it is hypocrisy, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so they may be honored by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. Sure, you're going to get that honor, but that's all you're going to get. You are not going to have a reward in heaven. You have your honor in full already. Look at verse 5. When you pray, you are not to be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners, so they may be seen by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. And look at verse 16. Whenever you fast, do not put on a gloomy face, as the hypocrites do, for they neglect their appearance, so they'll be noticed by men that they are fasting. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. All these things they're doing are good. Giving, praying, fasting. Jesus isn't reprimanding them because they're doing these good things. It's because they weren't really trying to accomplish good. They just wanted to be seen by men. They wanted this honor of men. This is a little bit confusing sometimes. What does Matthew 5:16 say? Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works. But here in Matthew 6 verse 1, the wording is almost identical. Matthew 5:16, let your light shine before men. Matthew 6:1, practicing your righteousness before men. But there's a difference in the rest of the verses, right? How do we know if I'm Matthew 5:16ing or if I'm Matthew 6 verse 1ing? How do we know? One is glorifying God. That's what I'm looking for. That's my goal, is for God to receive the glory. But the other one, notice some of the phrases. To be noticed by men, to be honored by men. So Jesus is saying, it's not that you're trying to hide your good works. It's not that no one can ever see you doing good works. But I'm going about my business and I'm seeing needs in the kingdom and in my neighborhood. And I'm seeing what I can do in the church, and I'm just going about my business doing it. And others are going to see that, and they're going to see my work, and God's going to be glorified for it. Or am I drawing attention to it to receive glory for myself? That's the difference. And Jesus knows the difference. He knows the difference in those righteous practices that we're doing because he can probe the heart and the mind, Jeremiah 20, verse 12. Sometimes it's a lot easier to look good than it is to be good. Our daily prayer can be Psalm 115, verse 1. Psalm 115, verse 1. Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory. So hypocrisy is one of those ways that we need to work on when it comes to looking the part. We can look the part. Another way is shaming. This picture is a fig tree in Jerusalem. So those Jewish leaders would even try to make others look bad religiously to make themselves look better. And maybe you're thinking, I would never do that. I would never try to make someone look bad religiously in order to make myself look better. Do you remember the illustration that Jesus gave of two men who were praying? One was a Pharisee, a religious leader, and who was the other person? A tax collector. Luke chapter 18, verses 10 through 14. And he explains why he had to share this parable in verse 9. He says he was telling this to some people who trusted in themselves that they were religious. And so these people who trusted in themselves, he's giving this example of two men praying, and you can see the religious leader, the honor the Pharisee wants for himself, right? He calls attention to his own good works, and he tries to discredit the other one. And in this passage, he specifically says, I thank God that I'm not like other people, like this person, even this tax collector, this publican over here. I do this, and this. And notice one of the things that he specifically mentions. I pay tithes of all I get. What were tax collectors known for? Robbing people, cheating people. He's trying to make him look bad religiously to make himself look. I give. This man takes. I'm charitable. He's a cheat. Trying to gain honor for himself. But where were they? Do you remember? They were in the temple. They were both in the temple. And what were they both doing? Praying. They were both at the temple to pray. Are we ever guilty of shaming others to make ourselves look better? Yes. Have we ever looked at contempt with someone struggling in their Christian walk? Have we ever felt a sense of superiority over someone who doesn't have the spiritual maturity to understand a certain teaching? Have we ever labeled someone who holds a different opinion or viewpoint, or even called them out, maybe even publicly, as a false teacher? When Jesus says that a false teacher is someone who is really a wolf who intends to harm the body of Christ and they're producing bad fruit, consider some of these things that we label each other over and divide over. Are they going to produce bad fruit down the road? Most of them not. Are we guilty of shaming other people religiously in order to make ourselves look better? We can look the part. We can dress a certain way. We can attend the right events. We can create the right image on social media. But what about our fruits? And the fruits that we're to be bearing, consider Galatians 5, love, joy, peace. All these things are others-focused. And my interaction with others. We can look the part. Second, we can even claim his name. This is Matthew 7, verses 21 through 23. We can even claim his name. This disturbing image that you see on the screen was in the museum in Jerusalem. It's an iron stake through an ankle bone. That's what you're seeing up on the screen. Look at Matthew 7, verses 21 through 23. Not everyone who says to me, what? Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Many will say to me on that day, what? Lord, Lord, Did we not prophesy in your name? And in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles. And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Lord, Lord, Kyrios, Master. Saying, in fact, to Jesus, I am under your authority. I am placing myself under your authority. 3 times Jesus says, in your name. We prophesy, we cast out demons, we're performing all these miracles, but Jesus says they were guilty of practicing what? Lawlessness. It's like they're saying to him, but look at all these other things I did over here. Depart from me, I never knew you. Many will say to me on that day, and the question for us is, are we in that number? And I know textually he's not talking about followers of Christ because he says, I never knew you. But can we be guilty of claiming his name, but not truly placing ourselves under his authority? Not really allowing him, his will, to control our lives. I call myself a Christian on social media. That's my description, follower of Christ. But does it match up with my tone or the things I post or other things that I see or my attitude? Is there no room for him to rule my heart because I'm the authority there? Or maybe I have the same heart problem the Pharisees did, and I'm just trying to draw attention to my good works. I can even claim his name. Jesus is Lord. But do I follow it? And third, it's what we do that matters. We can look the part, we can even claim his name, but it's what we do that matters. Verses 24 through 29. The picture you see are some mangoes that were growing around the Sea of Galilee. Verse 24 through 29. Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock, and the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who builds his house on the sand. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. When Jesus had finished these words, they were amazed at his teaching. The very first word in this section that we just read is therefore. And we know when we see that, we're going to ask ourselves what it's there for. And we look back at what he just said. Many are going to say to me, Lord, Lord. They're going to claim my name, and they're going to claim to be followers of mine. But do you act on what you've just heard me say? And this is a powerful conclusion to the whole Sermon on the Mount. Everything that I just said. I know you're hearing me, but are you going to act on it? There's a contrast here in these two individuals, the wise and the foolish. The rock and the sand. One fell, one did not fall. And what do they both have in common? They both heard the word, and they both encountered what? A storm, yeah. They both encountered the storm. The difference is one acted on the words of Jesus and one did not act on the words of Jesus. And there's a really interesting thing that happens. This, by the way, is a pomegranate in Jerusalem. It was in the very backyard of a house that we were staying in, just growing all over the yard. In the New American Standard, which is what I have in front of me, we read things like verse 17, bears good fruits and bears bad fruit. Verse 18, produces good fruit, produces bad fruit. Verse 21, does the will of my Father. Verse 22, performs many miracles. Verse 24, acts on them. Verse 26, does not act on them. All of those words come from the same Greek word. And they're translated all these different ways. Produce, bear, act, does. But it's one word throughout the entire text. And I think the New King James does a better job of translating it with the same word, mostly. But this one is all these different words, so you really kind of miss the fact that Jesus is saying it's what we do that matters. He's using the same word over and over again, poieo, to make, to accomplish, to do something over and over. This is what he's hammering home. And this is the productivity, our fruit. It's the productivity of our life. We're all bearing fruit of some sort or another, good or bad. Is it serious to Jesus? We look at some of the words that in all of these illustrations that he's using in our text. Beware, cut down, he uses in the first illustration. Thrown into the fire, I never knew you, depart from me, he uses in the second illustration. Here he talks about this great fall. So it's serious to him. Turn over really quickly to Matthew chapter 25. In Matthew 25, we see Lord, Lord, over and over in this text as well. Lord is a key word in Matthew, and when you look down through this chapter and you see Lord, Lord, and you see the word master used over and over again, starting at verse 18 and following, it's all the same word. It's all the same word. And here, he's talking about the wise and the foolish, and there are times when he'll say, I do not know you, verse 12. And he's talking about the sheep and the goats, and some that will inherit the kingdom of heaven and some who won't, to verse 34. And I want us to kind of focus in on what Jesus said made the difference in these two groups of people. And he says it's the one who gave, the ones who invited, the ones who clothed, and the ones who visited. Jesus says, to the extent that you did it, verse 40. So the ones who saw the needs but didn't do anything, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. And he specifically says to them, because, verse 42, you gave nothing. Because, verse 43, you did not invite, you did not clothe, you did not visit. And it's not that, sometimes we go to the opposite extreme and it's this long checklist of to-do things. I'm to be accepted by Jesus, I need to do this, let me check all these things off. That's not what he's saying. It's that mentality of, because he is my Lord and Master, I am others focused. I'm not trying to gain honor for myself. I'm not just trying to look apart. I see you. And I see you. And I see the cold and the hungry, and I'm going to act on all of these things that Jesus said. I'm going to produce good fruit because that's my focus. The Pharisees and all of their striving for honor, were they doing these things? Taking care of these humble needs that other people had? In Romans chapter 2, verses 6 and 7, it's ironic that Paul says, you're striving for all this honor for yourself, but here's who gets the honor. God will render to each person according to his deeds. To those who persevere in doing good, glory and honor. And he says again in verse 10, glory and honor to everyone who does good. So this picture, by the way, I don't know if you can tell on the screen, all these things down here at the bottom hanging down are more mangoes. They were prolifically growing all around our hotel. I didn't know they looked like that, hanging down on those stringy things. Mangoes growing, producing fruits all around the Sea of Galilee. And this powerful ending is our heart check as we spend time with Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Are you going to hear these words of mine and act on them? Is your righteousness going to exceed that of those Pharisees who are so consumed with receiving honor for themselves and looking the part? Paul, maybe some of you can relate to him because of his past and the things that he wrestled with, knowing what was in his rearview mirror. It is so encouraging to see him writing to the Roman church and those Christians and making some I am statements for himself. In Romans chapter 1, verses 14 through 16, he's able to make 3 I am statements. And he says, I am under obligation. Excuse me. Your version might read, I am not good. Sorry. Thanks. Excuse me. He says, I am under obligation. It might read, I am indebted. And do you remember who he says he's indebted to? The Jew and the Greek. My focus is on everyone around me. I owe them something. And what did he owe them? The truth. The gospel. Because of everything that God had done for him, everybody around him, he was indebted to them and he owed it to them. He says, I am under obligation. I am eager to preach. That's another one of those I am statements. In fact, he says in verse 16, and we're familiar with this, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power. I am not ashamed. And hopefully we can make these exact 3 I am statements. I am indebted to the people around me. I am eager to preach. I am eager to share the good news, and I am not ashamed. But I want you to think about you particularly. And if you were going to make 3 I am statements, what would you say? Now, aside from these, I know your Christianity is going to color those statements for you, just like they did for Paul. What 3 I am statements would you make about yourself? Would you say, I am committed? I am benevolent? I am compassionate? I am a soul winner? What 3 statements are you coming up with in your mind for yourself? And then the greater question is, what would the people who know you say? Would their statements for you match up with yours? When Jesus said, you will know them by their fruits, he used one of 2 different Greek words for know. They had one that meant just general knowledge. You know, you hear about something, you read about it, you can study about it, and so you have this general knowledge. And then there's another word for experiential knowledge. You really get it because you've experienced it for yourself. And that's the word Jesus used. They will know you by your fruits. Not because you look the part, not because you're claiming his name, but because they've experienced for themselves the fruit of your faith.